And Dave Gladney and Peter Kirstenau have joined.
Thank you. Chair Lehman? You can start when you're ready. The panelists are here and the commissioners are here. The vice chair's going to run it? Okay, thank you. Never mind.
Michael Yaki has joined.
Good morning. This meeting of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 12 noon on the 15th of June, 2018. The meeting takes place at the Commission's headquarters, located at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. I'm Vice Chair Timmons Goodson. Other commissioners present at this meeting are Commissioner Narasaki, Commissioner Harriet. I believe that Commissioner Digbale is in the building. A number of commissioners are participating by telephone. If you could confirm you're on the line after I say your name. I believe that we have on the phone Chair Lehman.
I'm here, thank you.
Commissioner Yaki.
I am here.
Commissioner Kirstenau.
Here, in addition to Davo, is Elvis in the building?
He has not yet arrived, sir. Commissioner Kirstenau, I've heard your voice. Commissioner Gladney?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. All right. Thus, we have a quorum of commissioners present. Is the court reporter present?
Yes.
Is the staff director present?
Yes.
This meeting shall now come to order. Commissioner Digbale is now present with us. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for the business meeting?
So moved.
Having been moved by Commissioner Narasaki, is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Do we need to move to amend?
Do you want motions to amend before or after?
I was going to approve the agenda and then go forward with amendments.
Okay.
If that's all right with everybody. All right, all in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
If there is any in opposition, I'll hear that. Any abstentions? Okay. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Any motions to amend?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to move to amend the agenda to remove the discussion and vote on the commission report and examination of excessive force and modern policing practices.
Second.
All right. Are there any other amendments?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I would like to amend the agenda to include a discussion and possible motion on printing reports.
All right. Is there a second to that motion to amend?
Kirstenau, second.
Okay. Are there any other motions to amend?
Madam Vice Chair,
Yes, Chair Lehman.
I'd like to move to amend the agenda to introduce a letter on separation of families as a board.
All right. Did
hear
everyone hear that? Her motion is to amend the agenda to include the introduction of a letter on separation of families at the border. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second.
Oh, all right. I believe I heard Commissioner Yaki seconding that. Okay. Are there any other amendments?
Madam Chair, Kirstenau here.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to amend the agenda to include a discussion on a statement regarding the recognition of Jack Johnson or the pardon of Jack Johnson.
Second.
All right. And so we have a number of amendments to the agenda. that are now up for vote. The first, well, I'll just read all of them. We'll be voting on all of them at one time if there's no objection to that. All right, the first being an examination of the, moving to a motion to remove that, the discussion of the report, examination of excessive force and modern police practices. A second amendment would be to discuss printing of our reports. A third involving the introduction of a letter on the separation of families at the border. And finally, a statement regarding the pardoning of Jack Johnson. All in favor of the agenda being amended as I have set forth, let me hear you say aye.
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 Are there any commissioners opposing the amendments to the agenda? Any abstentions? All right, it sounds as if it's unanimous then. Now, let us move to the speaker series. We have the pleasure of hearing from 3 speakers today as part of our continuing speaker series. Today's topic is 50 years later, reflecting on the 1968 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights hearings on the civil rights of Mexican Americans. Our staff director, Mr. Mauro Morales, arranged today's presentation. We'll turn to him now for some opening remarks before introducing the speakers. Mr. Morales.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and Commissioners. I'm proud to be an American and a Latino staff director of the Commission, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to make a statement. In a moment, you'll hear from a former staff member of the Commission, as well as distinguished scholars, about a historic hearing the Commission held 50 years ago in San Antonio, Texas. These presentations that the Commission has been holding for the past year and a half have allowed us to learn about civil rights history. We have heard about the creation of the Commission, the fight to end separate but equal schools, the struggles for equality for women, the disabled, gender issues, and challenges to racial and ethnic communities. I encourage the public and commissioners, if they haven't already done so, to read A Stranger in One's Land, published by our agency in 1970. The report documents the week of hearings this commission held 50 years ago in San Antonio, Texas. These hearings took place in 1968 during a dramatic time of change in our country. When I received this account that we published, I was shocked, but not surprised, to read the comments of a principal in charge of a San Antonio junior high school. This individual stated his belief that there is something in the background or characteristics of Mexican Americans that inhibits high achievement. He agreed that genetic factors account for differences in student achievement. I am a graduate of Georgetown University and the law school at the University of Southern California. I'm a member of the California District of Columbia Bars, as well as the presidentially appointed staff director of this agency. I am proof that such a statement was and remains pseudoscientific nonsense and is patently false. We can all agree that so much has changed when such an ignorant belief like that was publicly expressed, and yet we still have a long way to go. 4 weeks ago, the Commission held a briefing about the rise of hate crimes being experienced in this country. We heard about hatred being directed at people because of what they were wearing, what language they spoke in public, who they chose to love, because they had a disability, their gender, or their racial or ethnic background. It was compelling and heartbreaking testimony. At no time since the San Antonio hearings 50 years ago have Americans of Latino heritage felt more challenges to our right to be a part of this nation than right now. Our community regularly reads, hears, or are subject to attacks over our right to speak another language in addition to English, our presence as citizens, and even our patriotism. I am honored to serve as the director of this esteemed 60-year-old institution, where it is our mission to research and investigate civil rights policy and enhance the enforcement of federal civil rights law. The commission is a jewel and a national treasure. It is precious because of its independence and bipartisan nature, and because we can take the time to examine and understand how to address pressing civil rights issues. Our briefings and published reports have led to changes in federal civil rights law that have had lasting impact for our nation. Each commissioner, their special assistants, and all the men and women who work at this agency are dedicated to civil rights. Today, we'll learn how 50 years ago, the commission successfully exposed civil rights challenges faced by Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Obtaining knowledge from history is essential if we are to grow as a nation and as a people. I look forward to hearing from our speakers today. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Morales. You are a jewel and a treasure of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We thank you for bringing this program to us today. Our first speaker is J. Richard Avina, former director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, then field office in San Antonio, Texas. Mr. Avina drafted text used in the commission report entitled "The Tarnished Golden Door: Civil Rights Issues in Immigration." He was formerly employed in the Legislative Reference Department in the Library of Congress and taught for 7 years at the University of San Carlos. Our second speaker is Robert Brachetto, PhD, founding executive director, Southwest Voter Research Institute. He taught for 12 years in Texas at University of Texas at El Paso, Our Lady of the Lake University, and Trinity University. Working with William Velasquez at the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, he established the Southwest Voter Research Institute and served as its executive director from 1986 to 1995. At the request of the director of the Bureau of the Census, he launched one of the first census information centers after the 1990 census for minority researchers to access and use census data. He has also served as an expert witness in more than 40 voting rights cases throughout the southwestern part of the United States. As the research consultant to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, he conducted evaluations of low-income neighborhoods in San Antonio from 2000 to 2008. Since 2009, he's been a regular contributor of op-ed pieces to the San Antonio Express News on current issues, especially those affecting minorities. He is also author of more than 6 publications, both academic and popular, throughout his career. And our third speaker is Candace De Leon Zapata, PhD, chair of the Department of English, Mass Communication, and Drama at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas. Her field of study is in both Latina, literary and cultural studies, and rhetorical and written studies. Her scholarship is currently focused on how Hispanic serving institutions can better serve students of color with inclusive program design, curriculum, assessment, and culturally relevant pedagogies. She's the author of 6 book chapters related to these topics and is currently co-editing a book related to teaching practices for students of color. Dr. Zapata, joined the 50th Anniversary Events Executive Committee 2 years ago and is currently a Conference Planning Committee member. We will have questions and answers after all of our speakers have presented, and thus we will begin with Mr. Avena.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Commission, the Staff Director Morales, for your invitation, because those of us that are working on this project really believe it's historic in nature. And as I go through my material, I think you'll understand what I'm saying. I want to end, before I finish, let me tell you this. I have 2 stories to tell you. They're both true. One happened back in 68, 67, and one happened this year. And they'll give you an idea of the changes that have been made or that are making. I have some handouts here. I don't know if somebody could. Thank you. I haven't been back to the city for 15 years. I've never been to Europe. I've been to Latin America, but I still think Washington is the greatest, most beautiful city in the world. I drove a taxi cab here. I sold encyclopedias. You all don't remember what encyclopedias are. You do? Some of you do. To get through school. And in 1968, the Civil Rights Commission said, well, Richard, we're going to hold a hearing in San Antonio. Can you go down there for 6 months? 6 months. And work on the hearing, then come back? Oh, yeah. I'm from El Paso, so I'll be able to see Mom and Dad and, 6 months turned into 50 years, and here I am. Nothing to do with civil rights, but to dramatize the difference. If you worked for the government in 68, whether you went to New York, Chicago, Atlanta, San Antonio, or Washington, after paying for your airfare, your per diem was $16 a day. 16. 8 for your 3 meals, and 8 for your hotel. So you can see what difference that has made. I barely make the tip with $8, but anyway. In April of 1968, the New Mexico Advisory Committee to the Civil Rights Commission was holding a hearing in a little town I'm sure nobody's ever heard of called Clovis, New Mexico. Clovis, New Mexico is in the northern eastern part of the state. The reputation was so egregious as being racist against, there are very few blacks, but a lot of Mexican Americans. It was so bad that people gave it the ultimate insult. What is the ultimate insult you can give a little community? They called it Little Texas. Little Texas, it was so bad. It's close to the panhandle of Texas. The night before the hearing, we were sitting around the hotel waiting for a hearing. Our court reporter was there. Sterling Black, the son of Supreme Court Justice Black, was the chairman of the committee. When we got the word that Dr. Martin Luther King had been shot and killed in Memphis, we huddled around and we didn't know what to do. We thought, our first thought was to cancel the hearing. Then we thought, no, if Dr. King were still living, he'd want us to go ahead with the hearing. So we held the hearing. I made my way back. I flew to Atlanta and was able to march with my sister in the King funeral march from the church. And then I flew back to Washington. I got off of the airplane at Nashville Airport. The first thing that hit me was the smoke, the smell of the smoke of the homes and businesses burning down over and around Georgia Avenue. So we kind of settled down, and then 2 months after that, I was living over here by Arena Stage in a little apartment. 2 months after that, at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I can remember it was 3 because I looked at my watch, I get a call from Esteban Torres, who used to work for United Auto Workers, later became a congressman from LA, telling me that Robert Kennedy had been shot and killed in Los Angeles. The third thing that happened before I left was the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign was something else. Probably the first time in history that a great influx of Hispanics, Mexican Americans, Spanish Americans, as people from New Mexico like to call themselves, Spanish Americans, not Mexican Americans, and blacks convened in one place. And I remember well because Resurrection City was established, and the Mexicans and Hispanics didn't want to live in Resurrection City. And so we found them a school where they could live in, Hawthorne School. And so that was the third big major event that happened before I left. I left in August of '68 to go to San Antonio. Now, when we got to San Antonio, you have to realize that Mexican Americans were not known throughout the country. The census counted us as white, Caucasian. And so what was missing were demographics, dropout rates, unemployment rates, things like that nobody ever knew of because we were counted in the lump sum of being white. There were a lot of unrests around California, Colorado, Arizona. And so the commission decided to hold a hearing looking at the civil rights issues of Mexican Americans. The next big debate was where to have it. Came down to Los Angeles or San Antonio. Oh my God, Los Angeles, are you out of your mind? Those crazy people. They're going to disrupt the hearing.
We have a rule against defaming and degrading, and as someone from Los Angeles, I have to object. So.
I'm sure some of you, and I'm sure Los Angeles has changed, right? But anyway, so then I'm not from San Antonio, and I'd only been through there. They said, San Antonio. Oh yeah, that's more of a farm mentality, a rural mentality. People aren't so, so violent. So we'll go to San Antonio. I was listening to that debate while they were having it. I know that Mexican Americans were not known because in my job at the Library of Congress, I worked for Legislative Reference, which I was hired as a translator, the only Mexican American in Legislative Reference. And all these scholars, I mean, you think Bob's a scholar, they doubled him. They had 4 or 5 PhDs. I mean, really smart people. And then members of Congress start asking, who are these Mexicans? Who are they? What are their conditions? Nobody thought they were victims of discrimination. And I remember well, some of those real scholars would come and look for me in my basement office at the Library of Congress. Richard, do you know anything about Mexicans? What am I going to say? Well, I am one, but I wasn't hired as a researcher, so I didn't know the demographics. But I do know that the government really did know a lot about Mexican Americans. My first story, which is really going to give you a feeling for what happened around 67, 68. Henry Ramirez, who directed our first education study, tells a story of going to visit a public school in and around Kingsville, Texas. And he was talking to the teachers, the principal, and some of the students. And as he was getting ready to leave, the janitor called him over, Mexican-American janitor. He said, come here. So Henry followed him, and he led him out to the back of the school where he had his tool shed. The janitor had his tool shed. He asked Henry to step up on a little wooden stool. Henry didn't know what was going on. He said, look out that window. Mira por la ventana ahí. And Henry tells a story of looking out the window, and in the playground was a white Anglo female teacher holding a little Mexican girl by her ankles and whacking her on the butt. I mean, physically. Can anybody guess what her crime was? They caught her speaking Spanish. In Texas, it was in the Constitution that it was a crime to speak Spanish on public school property or activities. So Henry went on and he developed the education study. The education study, by the way, was a real success. By the way, all those studies that were done by the commission held the hearings in '68 in employment, education, administration of justice, economic security. And then the commission wrote their statutory reports. They all went through legal sufficiency, and they were used as evidence in lawsuits. I'm sure Bob knows a lot about this. They were used in school desegregation lawsuits. They were used in school financing lawsuits. There's something impressive, okay, that says the United States Commission on Civil Rights says, and when you present that in a court of law to a judge or to a jury, there's something impressive about that. So what you were saying, Mr. Morales, earlier is that this is truly a unique institution. And I hope you're around forever, and I hope you're always bipartisan. I hope you're always bipartisan. The commission accomplished a lot. It gave legitimacy to the issues of Mexican Americans. The reports, as I mentioned, were used as evidence and in trials and so forth. And this leads me to my last story. The decision was made in '68 to call the NAACP. It was a hearing on Mexican American civil rights issues, but the decision was made to call the NAACP and make a presentation. The black population of San Antonio was not that big. So 2 or 3 members of reverends came and presented before the commission. And one of the things they complained about, they said, you know, we have a hard time getting jobs with the city. And we have our utility called the Public Service Commission, yeah. And we can't get jobs there, but you know what? Very few black men are hired, but there are no black women at all. For some reason, they don't hire black women. Okay, so they said this to the commission in '68. Time goes by. I come back from Guatemala, where I'd been spending time teaching, and I pick up the newspaper, and this is this year. I see an article where there is a new CEO of the City Public Service Commission in San Antonio. A new CEO. All right. This year, before bonuses, before anything, her salary was $730,000. And you know what? She's an African-American woman. She's an African-American woman. So when things like that, you see things like that happening, you see that there may be hope. And I would love to have left you on a positive note, except for this handout that I gave you. These are babies. They're not in the United States. They're on the bridge coming from Mexico. They can't get in to claim asylum because there's no room. The U.S. side says there's no room. There's too much activity. They can't let them in yet. So they have to sleep and find places to eat on the bridge. Now, let me ask you, I talked to somebody yesterday about this. I said, now, look at these children. Can you believe that this would be happening if these children were white? Just answer yourself that question. If these were white kids, would our government let them be and exist like that? Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions after that.
Thank you, Mr. Urbina. Mr. Bruschetto?
Yes, commissioners, thank you.
Your mic is not on. If you wouldn't mind pushing the talk button.
To turn the mic.
Thank you.
All right. Commissioners, thank you for inviting us. And I know 1968 was a year that brought attention to race and ethnic relations. As Richard mentioned, there was a march in Los Angeles. 15,000 Latino high school students walked out of their classes to demand a better education. In April of that year, Reverend Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, followed by race riots, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, D.C. In June of that year, civil rights advocate Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles while he was campaigning to be president. And Americans wanted answers, and they wanted government action. And President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968 to end housing discrimination. And he proclaimed the first National Hispanic Heritage Week, put a positive focus on America's fastest growing ethnic group. It was also a time for reflection on race relations. The Kerner Commission report came out, released to try to understand the root causes of the riots. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights then held a hearing in San Antonio, Our Lady of the Lake University. For 6 days, the commissioners heard challenges facing Mexican Americans in Texas and other southwestern states. Now, here we are 50 years later, and a time when civil and human rights of Latinos are very much in peril. And so it's a number of leaders in San Antonio and scholars have taken it upon their own initiative to come together and in the same place in San Antonio in November of this year to hold up the mirror and reflect once again with a conference exploring what has happened since the 1968 Commission hearings. And it's my job here today to tell you about a report, hopefully will become a published book, that will explore the progress and the challenges that still remain for Mexican Americans. I'd like to tell you about each of the 15 authors and the chapters that they've written or are writing. It's a book in progress. But I don't have the time, so I'm going to focus on an example of one of the chapters on education. It'll give you an idea of what we're trying to accomplish with this volume. During his time as superintendent of Edgewood School District, which, by the way, was the poorest school district in the state, Dr. Jose Cardenas, who, by the way, the year before had testified before the hearings of the commission in '68, he helped launch the Rodriguez case, which challenged school finance system in Texas, and it was lost before the Supreme Court in 1973. But Cardenas went on from there to form the Intercultural Development Research Association, IDRA, with the goal of improving the educational opportunity of Latino students in Texas particularly. I worked for him, and I'm proud to say, as his first research director. There are 3 IDRA researchers that we have now who are collaborating to produce a chapter that traces the progress and the difficulties in achieving educational equity in Texas. David Hinojosa, who's a civil rights attorney, works full-time at IDRA on education. Maria Cuca Robledo Monticello, who succeeded Cardenas as the president of IDRA, and Aurelio Montemayor, who is their lead trainer of educators, who also, by the way, testified in the 1968 hearings of the commission. They're writing about the battles that were fought for equity in funding education with the help of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, both in the courthouse and the State House. They write about the progress that's made through litigation and policy changes in bilingual and multicultural education. They write about establishing the right of immigrant children, regardless of their legal status, to free public education. They write about the miseducation of migrant children and how advocacy groups emerged in the 70s to support better educational services for these needy students. They write about the improvement of college access and preparedness and the challenges of the rising tuition costs and the declining of state funding for higher education. They conclude with recommendations for equity-based remedies, improving the pipeline of K through 20 for all school children. So today, if you look at San Antonio, much as in other cities in the Southwest, and as it was in 1968, with 17 mostly segregated school districts, we find that some of the same problems exist. We find school districts that are 97% Mexican-American student enrollment in segregated neighborhoods with poverty rates exceeding 40%. Some of the same challenges. Education, by the way, is just one of the 8 areas that we're exploring, our experts are exploring in the study of civil rights of Texas Latinos. And from the indicators over the 50 years on population, employment, economic security, farm workers, and the justice system, they trace the changes and the progress and the problems over that period of time. And even issues that were not treated in depth in your 1968 hearings, like housing and immigration. We have Henry Cisneros is one of our experts while working with one of his experts at HUD to examine fair housing and affordable housing. We have Lee Teran, a professor of law at St. Mary's University School of Law and a lifelong litigator on immigration and human rights, who writes about the dramatic changes that have taken place in immigration policies and immigration practice. And by tracking the numbers, she has found that the federal government has arrested, detained, and deported more Latinos than at any time in history. Now, during the past 50 years, Latinos have grown to become the largest ethnic minority in the United States. They're already a majority population in large cities like San Antonio. Yet they still suffer high poverty rates and they have fewer educational opportunities than Anglos. And by the year 2060, the Census Bureau projects Hispanics will number about 119 million. And they'll be nearly 30% of our country's population. How can America thrive without removing all barriers to success for so many millions fellow citizens? This new book will look back at the 50 years since the last commission hearing in '68 in San Antonio, and what has happened to Mexican Americans since then. The idea of the book comes from Richard Avena. He's going to be writing the preface, and he started this with an idea. No money, just an idea. And now he involved many, many important people in the development of both a conference and a book, both academicians and activists. And they've been meeting each month now for about over 2 years.
Almost 3 years.
And they will hopefully create a blueprint for positive, lasting change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brusquetto. Dr. Cepeda.
Well, I want to thank the commission for inviting us. I also want to acknowledge Richard, as Bob said, for starting this off with a pretty profound idea. Where have we come 50 years later? Richard ended his introduction with saying he wished he would leave on a high note. Hopefully, I will conclude on that high note. That this conference, as a conference planning committee member, is ultimately about advocacy and civil rights. And which is why I was drawn to work with Richard when 2.5 years ago, our campus president at Our Lady of the Lake University, Diane Melby, and our provost, Dr. Marquita Evans, reached out to me to participate as a point of contact for our university to work with the executive committee. So I will speak mostly about the conference and the conference committee and where we were at, and then afterwards be happy to take any questions that you may have. And I know that the committee does have copies of sort of what I'm going to highlight, but I will go ahead and read some of this for those in the audience. So the conference planning committee role was ultimately to organize a call for papers. This is at the point of time where I was brought in to work with the executive committee. Our role was not only to craft and draft and write the call for proposals, which probably went through 10 or 11 drafts, but it was also to circulate the call for papers to not only universities and community colleges, but to social media sites, local and national community organizations, and our own individual points of contact. It was an exhausting experience to get the news out for those to participate in this conference. We also developed the conference agenda, secured conference space at Our Lady of the Lake University, and curate the concurrent sessions, as well as work with other subcommittee members to finalize the agenda. I am proud to say that I am working with 8 fierce and amazing Latina scholars and activists and community leaders that include Rosie Castro, who's also a Civil Rights Executive Committee member, Maria Antoinette Berriozabo, who's Civil Rights Executive Committee member, former City Council member, and she's currently part of the Housing Policy Task Force and for San Antonio. Dr. Bertha Perez, who is a retired professor out of University of Texas at San Antonio, Nicole Manzavalles, who is at Our Lady of the Lake University, and she's our JD ADA coordinator for services to students with disabilities. Barbara, the executive committee couldn't actually live without. She's the executive assistant to the 50th anniversary committee. Maria Vasquez, who's a program director of ACT Center for Equity and Learning, and Rebecca Flores, who is an activist and community leader. She's also the Texas director of the United Farm Workers Association. So I thought it was important to share with you a brief blurb. It's not the entire one of the call for papers that went out nationally. In 1968, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights held a 6-day hearing in San Antonio, Texas, to examine civil rights issues facing Mexican Americans in the U.S. Southwest. The hearings, held at Our Lady of the Lake University, examined education, employment, administration of justice, and economic issues. When the commission came under severe criticism from the established leadership in the local community, Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, president then of Notre Dame University and vice chairman of the commission, responded, quote, "We are not an enforcement agency. We make reports to the president and to Congress. All we do is hold up a mirror to the community and let them tell us if there are any problems. And that's what we're doing here," end quote. Hence the name of our conference. In November 2018, we returned 50 years later to Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas. Our goal is to examine our past and progress since the landmark hearings in Texas and explore the path forward for all Mexican American and Latino populations in the U.S. This conference will address changing civil rights, demographics, education, the administration of justice, economics, employment, immigration, political participation, and voting rights issues. We will also celebrate Mexican American contributions to the art and culture. The conference is open to civil rights leaders, historians, and representatives of academic, civic, and social civil rights and leaders, as well as arts and culture and student organizations in Texas and throughout. Our Lady of the Lake University is in San Antonio, Texas, situated in the west side, located by the beautiful Elmendorf Lake. Our Lady of the Lake was founded in 1895 by the Congregation of Divine Providence, is a co-educational liberal arts institution with an enrollment of approximately 3,300 students. A multi-campus regional university, Our Lady of the Lake has locations in San Antonio, Houston, and the Rio Grande Valley. And we are currently moving towards an extensive online presence. So the conference is this November 15th through Saturday the 17th. So just briefly to kind of give you an idea of some keynote speakers that will be speaking on those separate dates. On Thursday, there is going to be planned an art opening reception. Our keynote speaker will be San Antonio's First Lady, Erica Prosper. We will also have a reading by San Antonio's first Latino male poet laureate, Dr. Octavio Quintanilla. And we also have other tentative readings by other area poets and literary authors, as well as an art reception. This event will be open to the entire community. On Friday, we will have a welcome by our university's president, Dr. Diane Melby, and an introduction of keynote speaker by our own mayor, Ron Nuremberg. The keynote morning speakers will include former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro, our Congressman Joaquin Castro, and their mother, Rosie. Our lunch keynote tentative speakers include U.S. Senator of Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto, and retired University of Texas Pan American President and first Latina College President of University of Texas Systems, Dr. Bambi Cardenas. And on Saturday, our tentative speakers include City Council member Ana Sandoval and immigration rights leader Gabby Pacheco. So just for those in the audience to get an idea of our conference concurrent sessions, some of the themes right now that we're organizing include Chicana activism and leadership, education, the great equalizer in the unequal Texas, constructing Chicano Latino educational pipelines, a critical race conversation and analysis, family engagement in Chicano education, immigration, discussing Senate Bill 4, language, rights, policy, and leadership, historical reoccurring and new dynamics in civil rights from a political point of view, voting rights, urban housing, economic development, economic security and digital equity, bilingual education in San Antonio history and context, Mexican American studies for the masses, San Antonio East Side transition from African American to Mexican American, Mexican American community and public health, the critical significance of the 1975 Voting Rights Act, and we will have a significant amount of roundtable sessions focused on civic activism and civil rights. It is a big honor for me to serve with the executive leaders on this particular conference. As Bob can tell you, and as academics, we attend many conferences. It's part of our role as a faculty member, but this particular conference really holds a special place in my heart because, again, considering where we have come, sometimes I question how far we've come. And it's important we have these conversations to bring to light the injustices that are currently happening in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you to each of our speakers. I very much appreciate your presentation. And in just a moment, I'm going to open it up for questions and conversation with my fellow commissioners. I do want to apologize to you for not having been here in person at the beginning of your presentation. My daughter graduated 8th grade this morning, so I rushed here from that graduation to be with you. So terrific. Thank you. So I'll open for questions from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Decoy?
Yes, thank you for the wonderful presentations. I'm interested in taking us back to that time in 1968 when the original convening happened, and to understand what, if any, changes did you see that came out in the immediate aftermath? It's my experience that sometimes change in the area of civil rights has a longer breadth, and you have to plant seeds that get cultivated in a different time. But I'm interested to hear whether or not there were any things any immediate impacts, and then more broadly, how the work has continued.
Is that for me?
You can decide who wants to take it first.
I just want to mention a couple of things that are so visible. There are visible things, and then there are not so visible things. But I always had this thing about, in 1968, the Texas Department of Public Safety testified. And it was a big thing because of the farm worker movement in South Texas. Texas Rangers had no Mexican Americans, of course, no blacks, no women. Texas Rangers were found to have really brutalized the organizing efforts in South Texas of the farm workers. United Farm Workers under Cesar Chavez had their branch there. And this is another one of the main reasons the commission decided to go to Texas. And you know, I'm not an attorney, and I really respect attorneys, but the attorneys didn't want to deal with the Texas Ranger issues. I remember they said, no, that's too controversial. And my director, Sam Simmons, and Howard Glickstein, who was the acting staff director, said, no, you can't go to San Antonio in Texas and not deal with the Texas Rangers. So they were none. That was 68. In 72, the Texas Rangers underwent an reorganization, and they hired 2 Mexican-American Texas Rangers. We're going to have a count, but I don't know. But you know what? I have seen African-American Texas Rangers. I have seen Hispanic Texas. I haven't seen any women, but there are probably some women. So in the area of employment, I would say that there's some dramatic changes that I watch a lot of cable news. And we recently had that bombing in Austin. I don't know if you all heard about that. And there was at the FedEx building near San Antonio in Schertz, there was a bomb found. And so they're showing on the television, they're showing the head of the local FBI office, either the director or assistant director, tall, very dark complected African-American man as the head of the FBI office. That just doesn't happen. Next to him was a tall, and I keep emphasizing tall, dark complected Mexican-American who was the head of ATF. And they were in a press conference. Nobody said anything, just, oh, hey, that's great, that's wonderful. But I always think back in 1968. And so I think, in my opinion, employment has been some of the more recent and more rapid changes.
I would add to that yes, there has been some advancement considerably in employment. There's been advances in education. You can tell by just looking at the list of authors on the handout that I gave you for the book. And what do you see? Well, you see progress. You see 14 of those 15, I think it is, with Spanish surname, higher education, advancement, and so forth. But, there's some areas that I think that while certainly there were some advances made, there's areas where there's regression and need for more advancement. Let me give you one of them. The farm workers at that time were a flashpoint in our history. They had Cesar Chavez had stricken in 1965 over in California, brought the strike to the Valley in Texas in 1966. The farm workers came and testified at your hearings at that time, along with Commissioner Ali, who was head of the Texas Rangers, and there was a tremendous amount of conflict going on with regard to the farm worker issue. Well, the farm workers today have almost been driven out of their work by maybe globalization is part of the reason. But I asked one of our authors of that chapter, name's Rebecca Flores, who at that time was an organizer and was trained by Cesar Chavez, was organizing in the Valley and started an organization at that time called LUPE, La Unión del Pueblo Entero, which was really a means of organizing colonias in the Valley, these poor communities that are unincorporated, substandard housing. Some of them don't even have potable water and electricity. And she continued after the strike ended, and even after many of the workers no longer had jobs in the fields and so forth, to organize these colonias. We still have, of course, colonias today in Texas, and we still have problems of housing. At 1968 was a year when we passed the Fair Housing Act. And indeed, it was a time of great hope for achieving fair housing. When we say fair, we mean affordable housing too. We still have tremendous challenges in regard to providing fair, affordable housing in this country. And segregation in the neighborhoods is still very, very evident. So, you know, there's some areas. Voting rights is one. If you recall, back at that time in '68, we just had passed 3 years earlier the Voting Rights Act, particularly impacting blacks in the South, but also in 1975 extended to language minorities, many provisions of the Voting Rights Act extended to language minorities. And we brought a lawsuit then against San Antonio for a discriminatory election system, at-large election system. Many changes occurred after the Voting Rights Act was applied to Mexican Americans. There's almost been a major transformation of the types of election systems in Texas that are now fairer, and that's why you see more elected officials that are Mexican American. So there's been challenges and successes, and I think that's our point of this conference and of documenting all of this and trying to track those types of changes that have occurred over the 50 years to see what needs to be done and to look to the future.
Actually, I just have one brief to address that. It is, you know, there are some areas that are significantly improved, but we still have a long way to go in higher education. So although Hispanic serving institutions, also under the umbrella of minority serving institutions, have significantly increased within the last 10 years, with, you know, I think we're close to like 450 HSIs throughout the Southwest. Full-time faculty who identify as Latino or Latino still make up only 3% of faculty at universities nationwide. Latinas make up only 1.5% of faculty members at all universities. And even though we're seeing a steady increase of Latino students going to universities, they're still not graduating at the same rate as non-Latinos. It's significantly, typically by their junior, senior year, they don't complete their education. And so there's still room for improvement, but I think even in higher ed, we need to look at how our universities could better serve the students who are populating them, particularly with administrators or faculty.
One more. I note that MALDEF and La Raza Unidos were founded at about that time. Was there a relationship between the convenings and the community coming together and the growth of these groups that would carry the message and the advocacy further?
Well, MALDEF was founded in 1968, and the first executive director and legal director, Pete Tijerina, testified at the hearing. And I remember he testified along with another attorney, Matt Garcia, about the lack of Mexican Americans on juries. They said they had conducted or filed many lawsuits where they, in deep South Texas, where the Mexican American population was 70–80%, and there were no Mexican Americans on the jury. So they discussed that. One of the things that Pete Tijerina talked about and he announced was that they had just filed one of the very first lawsuits in Texas. And the commissioners asked him, where was this? He said, we sued the city of Marlin, Texas. And what was that suit about? They had the director, the man who ran the swimming pool, as saying, as a witness, is saying, I would rather close the swimming pool than let Mexicans swim in it. Now, to me, that goes back to the Deep South, because I had some experience in civil rights in the South as well. And I kept thinking of those kinds of things. Now, I haven't been to Marlin. I don't think I've ever been through Marlin. It can't be that big of a town. But you can't go there now, or you can't go to any swimming pool, but you see everybody swimming, So those are kinds of things that MALDEF. Southwest Voter was established when?
Now, let me tell you about that one. That's interesting. Early 1970s, Willie Velasquez formed.
By the way, excuse me, Bob. I gotta get this in. Willie Velasquez was a member of the Texas Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Rosie Castro was a member of the Texas Advisory Committee, as was Maria Berriozábal. And so I want to give a plug to the advisory committees. They do a hell of a job. Okay.
That's very good. And they're all part of that history.
Yes, they are.
I was just going to tell you about how they work together, which was your question. There's three organizations, for example, that were working on voting rights back then. Willie Velasquez has formed the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project in the early 70s, 1973. And then they began to establish an office in the same building, on the same floor as MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I joined them in the early 80s, 82. And then there was a third organization, actually was part of, at that time, it was Texas Rural Legal Aid. It was on the next floor up. And the three of them worked together to file lawsuits challenging election systems that discriminated. And so they began making lists and doing the research, and that's why they hired me to dig into some of the research and to get at the data on what we could use to bring into these lawsuits. And serving as an expert witness, challenging the at-large election systems, for example. Our very first suit that we worked with MALDEF was in San Antonio, challenging the at-large election system of electing city council members, 1975. And right as soon as the Voting Rights Act was extended to language minorities, they worked together. And now in this book, we hope to enumerate, the authors are working on a list, an inventory of all those suits in Texas that were filed and brought about changes in the way in which we elect our public officials, not only in the cities, but also in school districts and in other public government offices, county level, as well as state representatives in state offices. So I think that's really part of the job here in trying to see how these organizations work together to bring a transformation that wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have the types of laws like the Voting Rights Act to help. And now we see attacks on that very law that were made. The Section 5, which was essentially disabled, was the way in which we often, and this was done in the city of San Antonio case, where she brought, where the Justice Department would be involved in pre-clearing any changes that were to be made in election systems. And at that time, powerful tool for bringing about changes. That is no longer available to us. So it's up to the Congress now to replace, if you want, Section 5 with a formula that would say which states are to be pre-cleared and so forth. That something that indeed we certainly need at this time. And so there's a lot of things that where we've made some great progress. Then we need to go back and revisit them and make sure that we shore up our civil rights tools to continue to bring about change.
Thank you, Dr. Brusqueta. Mindful of time, I understand that the Vice Chair has some questions as well.
Just very quickly, I'm fascinated with holding up a mirror. And so I was wondering, holding up the mirror to an issue, for example, of in the area of administration of justice, what do you have to share about current juries, Mexican Americans serving on juries, the number of prosecutors, elected prosecutors, and also just holding up that mirror to voting as it relates to voter IDs? If you'll just say a word or two about those. We have one of the attorneys that actually worked for the commission at one time, who worked for MALDEF, is doing is putting together the information on the current juries. But anywhere you go in South Texas, I see anyway, a large number of Mexican Americans on juries now. Now, grand jury system was changed. I think George Corba was telling us, a grand jury in Texas has always been the elite. You pick the elite people to be the grand jurors, but the regular juries that serve on the lower courts, I think that now, as far as African American participation, like in Houston, Dallas, or wherever, I really couldn't say. But I just from observing, I think there's been a big increase. Yeah. And by the way, mentioning the holding up the mirror, when the commission opened its hearings in San Antonio, we were attacked by everybody. Not everybody, but virtually everybody. And you know who one of our biggest opponents was? The local congressman, Henry B. Gonzalez. I mean, he went after the big shots like Howard Glickstein, but I remember riding around listening to he came after me personally. He didn't know who I was. But he said, "You're wasting money. Why are you spending a little bit of information? The hearings cost between $250,000 and $300,000 to put on." That was a lot of money in those days. But I'll never forget that. He came after us. And Father Hesburgh said, "Well, hey, wait, we're just holding up the mirror. That's all we're doing. The people are doing the talking." But that's part of the history. That's going to be part of our history. That's why we're looking so forward to this.
Just as a little something on the key man system of jury selection, which existed in Texas until just, I think it was a year ago or this year. There was we called it the pick-a-pal system of choosing grand juries, because they would select friends of theirs, people. The key man system was selecting others who were in the community to serve on the jury. And what you'd end up with, of course, was a jury that was very lopsided in favor of one group of prominent individuals in the community who were often white men. Now, I think that's going to be changing. We certainly have challenged it in court in many ways and able to show statistically that this is not something that could happen by chance if you pick jurors out of the jury pool of voters, for example.
Thank you. Commissioner Narasaki.
So many questions. So one quick one, I'm very curious, because we are getting ready to pick hearing topics for the next year. So where did the idea come to hold, because that's a long hearing, that was a week-long hearing, right?
Yeah.
We struggle over doing something more than 4 hours with our resources. So, so I'm just wondering who was driving that, since MALDEF hadn't organized and a lot of the infrastructure that exists today did not exist then. Was it Father Hesborough? Was it someone on the commission? Was it the State Advisory Committee?
No, Dr. Hector Garcia was appointed right before the commission, the first Mexican American on the commission. I think part of it had to do with the president, LBJ. I think part of it had to do with the uprising of the Mexican Americans who, having had experience in the Black civil rights and in the Mexican American civil rights, there was an impact, there was an influence of the Black militant civil rights movement that affected the Chicano movement in the Southwest. And the Chicano movement was looking to see what's going on, what's happening there. And by the way, many Mexican American organizations and Mexican American people that I talked to, they didn't believe the civil rights laws were for them. They said, oh yeah, well that's for the blacks, right? Well, they didn't understand that. And so I think it just kind of built up. I'll tell you, the commission held a hearing in San Francisco where, and I don't have my facts accurate, but the story was that Father Hesburgh, there were some militant students up in, of course, Berkeley, right? I mean,
Still the case.
Yeah. And the commission was holding a hearing on education. And some Chicano students got up and raising hell about education and so forth. And I have to be very careful because I'm not sure it was Dr. Hesburgh, but one of the commissioners got up and said, well, you know what? You people should be thinking about this because I just came back from Peru and you should see the conditions those Peruvians have down there. And proverbial hit the fan. And they jumped and said, we're not Peruvians, we're Americans. And so I think all of that combination, and I don't know of any one person, but I would say the collective wisdom of the commission, at that time led by Dr. Hanna, I think, from Michigan State, Father Hesburgh from Notre Dame. And they just said, we better do something.
Could you lean forward closer to your microphone just so we can record?
What's that?
Could you lean forward closer to your microphone so we can record the testimony? Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a documentary about Father Hesburgh that's just been finished that I'm going to go see. So maybe we'll see. In that.
Wonderful.
I just had two other short questions.
Commissioner Yaki has a question as well, and we're also over time, so maybe one.
Okay, I don't know which one to choose, because I wanted to ask about the high school students, but I will ask about Section 203, because we're getting ready to issue our report on the Voting Rights Act, and we're looking at all these sections, and no one's really been able to tell me how this Section 203, the language assistance provisions, came to be, that really added in protection for Latinos, but also Native Americans and Asians.
Asian Americans and Native.
And I've always been curious. I could sort of see how Latinos, but I've always been curious how Asians got thrown in because Asians did not have much political power at that point.
Do you know that, Bob? I attended a voting rights conference in 2015 in Austin, and a lot of that came out. There was a woman who worked for us, Pat Villarreal, who was an attorney. She worked both in San Antonio and here, and she worked for Don Edwards from California. And the story was that she actually helped write that and started pushing Congressman Edwards. I really don't know all the details, but also MALDEF was involved with it.
I don't know the details on that either, I'm sorry. But I do know that language minorities were certainly brought in at that time in 75. And I'm sure there was a strong push to look at questions that have to do with fairness at the ballot box and at that time.
Yeah.
So we'll turn to Commissioner Yaki for the last question.
Thank you very much, and thank you, the panel, for some amazing words of wisdom and reflection. I've got to say that I'm sort of the someone who delves a little bit more into the politics, having been in politics most of my life. And one of the things that has struck me is that frequently commentators, analysts have talked about the Latinos as the sleeping giant of electoral politics, but every year it seems to not be the case. And I'm just wondering, what is it that you think that maybe this follows up a little bit from Karen's question, but from Commissioner Narasaki, but what do you think of that perception, and how do you explain either it's is it accurate or is it not accurate? And I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, because again, every election cycle, people talk about, given the growth in the Latino community and given the presence in a lot of key areas of this nation, that this will be the year that their influence as a voting bloc comes to pass, and each year it seems not to be. At least the perception is. So, your thoughts?
Well, one thing I've noticed in working with Willie Velasquez and working on voting rights and voter mobilization was that when we began to organize in local communities on local elections where Latinos could actually run as candidates, that's when Latinos began to participate in the voting and turning out at the polls. Willie Velasquez had sort of an approach that he used that involved several steps. The first step was to challenge the election system that was discriminating, get rid of it, change it. If it was an at-large election, you needed a majority to win, and you were a minority of the population, people were voting along racial lines, you were discriminated against. So we challenged at-large election systems in the courts. Once that was changed, and those barriers were removed, you then registered voters. And the way you ran a registration project was to get Latinos themselves to recruit. You set up an office in the town. You get them to recruit locally to get people involved and registered. And that same group then, he would step out at that point. The third step was that group that had been registering voters could now pick their own candidates and make sure they had someone that they could support for that position on the city council or the school board on the local level. And they would get them out to vote in those elections. So it really involved getting people engaged in the electoral process at each level. Not only in registering and voting, but also in supporting a candidate and getting people to participate in their actual government system. I think that was kind of key. And if you don't see participation by a ethnic group in an election, it's probably because they don't see that their interests are represented in that election.
Just briefly to address that, Texas recently adopted high schools could participate in electing their own ethnic studies course. Well, this past week, it changed the name from ethnic studies to Mexican American studies. And since students, in the high school systems will now be able to learn their history. And I think part of what Bob and Richard is addressing also involves having students early enough learn their history to, if anything, be have their civic consciousness at least move towards participating in knowing how to be involved. And so hopefully we can start educating our youth to understand how to be more actively involved in their own communities, to be awoke in political structures.
Thanks very much to each of you. I am going to have to cut us off there. I really appreciate this lively conversation. And we will take a break now before reconvening for the rest of the business meeting for today. We'll take a 10-minute break and come back at 1:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I will call us back to order for the next part of our business meeting. The next item on our agenda is a discussion and vote on State Advisory Committee Chair nominations. Before we begin the discussion, I remind my fellow commissioners that the commission has a policy not to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person. Each of these individuals has agreed to volunteer time and energy in the pursuit of the protection of civil rights, which we appreciate. I also understand that a commissioner has requested that we table for our next meeting a discussion and vote on the DC State Advisory Committee Chair. So we'll proceed only with discussion of the other three. So with that, I'll begin with the Arkansas Advisory Committee. The staff director has recommended for appointment Carol Johnson as chair of the Arkansas Advisory Committee. To open the floor for discussion, I move that we approve this appointment. Do I have a second?
Madam Chair, I second it.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on this appointment? Hearing none, I'll call the question and take a roll call vote. Commissioner Adegbile, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
Aye.
Commissioner Kursnow? Commissioner Kursnow, are you on the phone? We'll come back. Commissioner Cladney?
You're on mute, Peter.
We're not present at the moment. Okay, Commissioner Cladney, how do you vote? I vote yes. Commissioner Narasaki, how do you vote?
I vote yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
I'm here, so I'm voting yes.
Okay. The motion passes.
I don't think I voted.
Oh, I'm sorry, Vice Chair, how do you vote?
And I'd like to register yes.
It passes by a larger margin.
Thank you. Apologies. The motion passes. No commissioner opposed. 2 commissioners did not answer, and so therefore abstained, and all others were in favor. Next, we'll turn to the district. We'll skip the District of Columbia for the moment. Next, we will turn to the Florida Advisory Committee, and the staff director has recommended for appointment Nadine Smith as chair of that committee. To open the floor for discussion, I move that we approve this appointment. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion of this appointment?
I'm just curious why we skipped John Malcolm for the DC Advisory Committee. I mean, part of the reason I'm willing to vote yes is that John Malcolm is on the list here.
Thank you. As I mentioned, and perhaps you didn't hear me, that
Sorry, I must not have.
one of the commissioners has requested that we table that discussion for the next business meeting. And so we'll table that one and proceed with the other state advisory committees. So is there any discussion about the Florida State Advisory Committee chair? Hearing none. Commissioner Adegbile, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I had intended to vote yes because I thought that this was a situation where we were willing to go forward with a advisory committee chair who was not on the far left. But since that's been tabled, then I'm going to abstain.
Okay. Commissioner Kursnow, how do you vote?
Abstain.
I'm sorry, did you say abstain?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Cladney, how do you vote? Commissioner Cladney, are you there? Vice Chair, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners abstained, no commissioner opposed, and all others were in favor. Finally, the staff director has recommended for appointment Melanie Vigil, Melanie Vigil, as chair of the Wyoming Advisory Committee. To open the floor for discussion, I move that we approve this appointment. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion of this appointment? Hearing none, I'll call the question, take a roll call vote. Commissioner Adegbile, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
I abstain.
Commissioner Kursnow?
No.
Commissioner Cladney?
Yes.
Thank you. Vice Chair Timmons-Goodson?
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki?
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki?
Aye.
And I vote yes. The motion passes. One commissioner abstained, one commissioner opposed, and all other commissioners were in favor. We'll now turn to our State Advisory Committee. We'll now turn to our State Advisory Committee presentations. We will hear first from the New York State Advisory Committee. Committee Chair Alexander Corey, and the committee recently released a report titled "The Civil Rights Implications of Broken Windows Policing in New York City and General NYPD Accountability to the Public." Chair Corey, we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. I apologize in advance if I exceed my allotted time. As you mentioned,
I'll be happy to cut you off when that happens.
Feel free. As you know, as you just said, we released our report in March of this year. The committee focused its inquiry on whether low-level NYPD enforcement disproportionately affects communities of color in New York City, and particularly the youth in those communities. At the same time, the committee invited comment on the accountability structures and mechanisms of the NYPD and how they affect both police officer behavior and the public's perception of the NYPD. The NYPD is a huge organization with a 2018 fiscal year budget of $5.6 billion, and so this report was no easy task. The committee held 2 days of public briefings, and we also held 3 different meetings with senior leadership of the NYPD to understand their point of view. Our bottom line conclusion was that broken windows as a policy is broken. Beginning with the Floyd mandated stop and frisk reforms and accelerating in the last 2 years with a host of other reforms, the NYPD has taken huge steps towards 21st century policing. However, arresting or providing summonses to New Yorkers, particularly Black and Hispanic youth, for low-level, non-violent offenses, we believe disproportionately affects those communities least able to endure the consequences of that enforcement and ought not to be part of an enlightened governance or policing. Broken windows policing began in New York City in the early 90s. Based on an academic theory that postulated that strict enforcement of low-level crimes known as quality of life offenses would reduce the likelihood of serious crimes. The policy resulted in New York City in a high number of summonses and arrests for individuals engaged in such activity as hopping a subway turnstile, smoking marijuana, riding bicycles on sidewalks, disorderly conduct, urinating in public, consuming alcohol in public, or loitering in the park. There are significant collateral consequences to this type of enforcement, among them arrestees who languish in jails awaiting prosecution because of their inability to make bail, which is a subject for another time. As a result of broken windows policing, misdemeanor arrests in New York City increased drastically from 1994 to 2010, in which there were approximately 292,000 arrests for misdemeanors. The NYPD claims that its policing was responsible in large part for New York City going from a city that in 1990 had 9.6% of the nation's homicide to one in 2013 that had 2.4% of the nation's homicide. But since 2010, the number of misdemeanor arrests has steadily declined each year, and we're now back at pre-broken windows levels of about 179,000 per year, which is still a very high number. And yet, in 2017, New York City achieved the lowest per capita murder rate since 1951, experienced the fewest shootings in the modern era, and saw robberies drop to their lowest level since 1965. At the same time, the number of criminal summonses also declined every year, but still at a very high number of 296,000 in 2016. The most frequently charged criminal summons offenses were consumption of alcohol on the street, disorderly conduct, and possession of marijuana. All of those together comprising about 120,000 criminal summons offenses in 2016. In the recently released second quarterly NYPD report on summonses issued in New York City, the most frequently charged non-vehicular and non-administrative criminal summonses continue to be marijuana use and consumption of alcohol. Critics of broken windows policing argue that there's no statistical correlation between quality of life enforcement and serious crime reduction. a point of view seemingly supported by the statistics I just cited, as well as by the New York City Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD, which issued a report in 2016 that found no empirical evidence demonstrating a clear and direct link between an increase in summons and misdemeanor arrest activity by the NYPD and a related drop in felony crime. The OIG did, however, note that the rate of quality of life enforcement in precincts citywide was positively correlated with higher proportions of Black and Hispanic residents, and requested that the NYPD release several sets of data regarding the effectiveness of broken windows enforcement and its impact on specific demographic groups who are disproportionately affected by the enforcement. The NYPD has chosen not to take on these recommendations. Irrespective of the merits of the underlying policy, the record seems to indicate that broken windows policing does disproportionately affect communities of color. Critics argue that NYPD officers are more likely to issue low-level summonses and make arrests in predominantly Black or Hispanic neighborhoods, and the statistics seem to support them. In 2015, over 90% of the approximately 315,000 people arraigned in New York City criminal courts were Black or Hispanic, and roughly 80% of those arraignments were for misdemeanors or violations. And according to 2016 census data, the population of New York City is 32% white, 29% Hispanic, 22% Black, and 14% Asian. 2016 data shows that for each misdemeanor category in which the NYPD reports statistics, Blacks and Hispanics made up between 75% and 83% of those arrested. Moreover, during the fourth quarter of 2017, at least 61% of criminal summonses issued in New York City were issued to people who were either Black or Hispanic, and at least 67% of criminal summonses were issued to people of color, with the remaining being issued to either whites or, quote, people of unknown race. Between 1997 and 2016, as well, approximately 85% of the 700,000 individuals arrested for low-level possession of marijuana were Black or Hispanic, at a time when there's substantial evidence that whites' usage of marijuana is at least equal to, if not greater than, marijuana usage by people of color. In 2017, the NYPD still made 17,000 marijuana-related arrests, 86% of which were of Black or Hispanic people. And the number of criminal summonses mirrors those numbers. It's also the case that Blacks are more likely than whites to be taken into custody rather than being given what is called a desk appearance ticket in New York, which allows the person being arrested to avoid being placed into custody until arraignment for misdemeanor or violation arrest. In the fourth quarter of 2017, Blacks were given desk appearance tickets for 34% of arrests in which one could have been given, while whites were given desk appearance tickets in lieu of custodial arrest for 47% of arrests in which one could have been given. Likewise, 90 to 92% of individuals ticketed or arrested for subway fare evasion each year are people of color. The NYPD makes a big point that the data merely reflects the makeup of the population that commits the crimes and is based on those that report them. And it says that it's an entirely false narrative to imply that the disproportionality in the statistics demonstrates that the NYPD's methods of enforcement are in any way discriminatory. It should be noted that in the Floyd case, Judge Scheinland concluded that the NYPD stop-and-frisk policy was tantamount to indirect racial profiling, and that senior NYPD officials, quote, acted with deliberate indifference to the NYPD's practice of making unconstitutional stops and conducting unconstitutional frisks. Whether as a function of court mandates or political pressure from advocates or just internally generated changes, the NYPD has recently instituted a series of reforms that seem to pay heed to some of the data as well as the import of cases like Floyd. Among other things, as we noted in the report, the NYPD has reformed officer evaluation metrics so that officers are no longer evaluated by the number of arrests they make, but rather it's on the ability to solve problems creatively. They've also been given discretion to issue civil summonses rather than criminal summonses. The NYPD says that it's really focused now on training their officers to address implicit bias and improve their problem-solving skills. And they've also been publicizing their neighborhood policing and precision policing, which is aimed at getting to know the neighborhood better and tracking individual criminals and guns, and not just stopping whoever they think may be committing a crime, or maybe about to commit a crime. Some commentators argue that the improvements in training have not yet translated into improved relations with the community because NYPD officers are still not held to the standards that are imparted upon them in training. Critics also contend that while the NYPD says it no longer evaluates officers on the basis of quotas, there's reason to believe that the NYPD historically employed quotas and continues to employ the de facto quota system, particularly in communities of color, a contention that the NYPD vehemently denies.
Chair Corey, thank you very much for the presentation. I want to make sure that there's time for questions and comments from the commission. So I'm going to open it for that now.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Commissioner Arasaki.
Thank you for the very thorough work that your State Advisory Committee did. We did a hearing up there as well on this similar topic, and so some of the things that you were talking about reminded me of that and the testimony we had from one former law enforcement person who said that the reason why there was so much more drug arrests for minorities was because the officers had quotas, and if they tried to arrest middle class or wealthier people who had the means to complain politically to the mayor, then they knew they would get in trouble, so they went after people who they knew would not be able to be similarly situated politically. So the data seems to bear out that testimony. I'm very.
I think the same issue actually applies to marijuana enforcement because obviously they've been enforcing marijuana smoking in the streets, particularly, and it's the case that in white neighborhoods that there's fewer police, less of a police presence, and also people don't tend to smoke on the street as much as in whatever place that they can find indoors. So I think that's another factor.
Yeah, I was very interested in your recommendations. So one of them was that the NYPD should incentivize the supervising officers to accurately review their subordinates' performance and create clear, widely publicized punitive consequences for supervising officers' failure to comply. So was there a was there finding that there's widespread issue, and what would the incentivizing be?
Well, I think, one of the problems that, as we point out in the report, is that there are very few complaints. There's a complaint process, and there are very few complaints that end up with any police officer being disciplined. It's sort of hard to get to that point. People are intimidated about filing a complaint because of what they have to go through in order to prosecute that complaint or to continue to pursue the complaint. And so one of the things I think that we would want to see is specific changes in the patrol guide rules, and then with those changes, real consequences being spelled out for what happens when somebody has actually broken those rules. The CCRB, it takes a long time to get a case through to the CCRB, and when they come out, many times those cases are changed, or the outcomes are changed, and the public never really kind of hears about it. I think one of the things that we would be looking for is greater transparency, because when people feel that there's actually an outcome that's happened, there are very few bad apples probably amongst the NYPD, but when there are bad apples, then what happens is that those consequences, if there are no consequences that are shown, then the public, I think, loses its trust in the process and in the institution. So we would be hoping to have something with greater transparency and with more clear rules, so that the infractions don't become system-wide.
I know Commissioner Cotney has a question as well, but go ahead, Commissioner Narasaki, if you have another one. I think your mic's on.
Sorry. And then also, one of your recommendations was about the early warning detection system and the data collection that's done on each officers, because we have ourselves heard testimony about the fact that it's really only a very small percentage of officers who are repeatedly having issues, and one of the things that we could do to solve some of the misuse of force is to try to identify those officers early and either give them retraining or move them on to a job that might suit them better. And your recommendation was to incorporate better data on level of arrests and summons, number of resisting arrests, number of obstruction of governmental administration, number of disorderly conduct, adverse suppression rulings, and adverse credibility rulings. And I was very interested where that came from. So that's the first I've seen that kind of recommendation, and it sounds like it makes sense.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, we don't, I think, actually know whether it's just a few bad apples. I mean, you know, that is a statement that the NYPD makes. That's the statement that's backed up by, I think, the number of cases that are actually brought to fruition under the, you know, from the CCRB's point of view. But you know, before Floyd and before body-worn cameras, I think that we, you know, had a dearth of information in the last few years. The amount of data that's going up as a result, partially of legislation, is increasing, and so people can actually try to start to track that stuff. But as I mentioned in the in the report, and the New York Times followed up last week with a story on Section 50A of the statutes, New York State statutes. There is a prohibition on disclosing confidential information about police officers, and so we don't necessarily know what kind of disciplinary action has been taken by officers that didn't rise to the level of sort of you know, CCRB action. And I think there's a move afoot to try to change that. And certainly one of our recommendations to change that law so that we have greater visibility on whether or not it's just a few bad apples. But as to your question on early warning, on the early warning system, there was a specific, and I don't quite remember at this time the particular individual who testified before us, but who is an expert in sort of risk systems, and who argued in favor of those specific types of early warning sort of inputs into the system.
Thank you.
I know I read in this year's police report, NYPD annual report, that they are moving towards implementing, you know, a more sophisticated early warning system this year, but those inputs still are open question.
Thank you. Commissioner Cladney, I understand you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank your SAC. Commissioner Adegbile and I attended these hearings, and I just thought they were excellent, well done, and the participation by the Commission was just superb.
Thank you, Commissioner.
One of your statements had to do with jumping subway turnstiles, and as I recall, when I was at the meeting, it was mostly juveniles, and they would be arrested for this offense, and that would affect their schooling, and sometimes they would become suspended as a result. Was there a crossover there? And if so, can you expound on that?
Well, I think there's crossover to this extent. I mean, that there are two factors. One is either you're arrested or you're given a criminal summons. In either case, you're absent from school, which is not necessarily the best objective for our youth. I don't know that there's specific crossover, but I will say this, that you may have read in the New York Times that there's been a lot of discussion about how subway fares are high for low-income New Yorkers, and that many of the subway the evaders, the turnstile jumpers, are really youth who can't really afford to keep paying the subway fares, and the City Council and Mayor de Blasio have just reached an agreement in which they're going to subsidize city subway fares for those individuals who are under the poverty line. They're going to pay half the fares. So So, but I see your question as crossover. I don't know specifically that crossover question. I do know that missing school is obviously an issue, and whenever you have a criminal summons or you're arrested, you're missing a lot of school.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chair Corey, we really appreciate your presentation to us and also the work of the State Advisory Committee on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll turn next to a presentation from our Minnesota Advisory Committee Chair, Velma Corbell, on their recently released report titled Civil Rights and Policing Practices in Minnesota. Ms. Corbell?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Thank you for allowing me to present today. First of all, I would let the Commission know that we chose the topic, policing practices in Minnesota, after a lot of discussion and a lot of winnowing down of several topics. But this is the one that at the time was the most compelling for us as a committee and was most relevant at the time because there had been recent events in the state of Minnesota, recent police shootings in the state of Minnesota. And also it was consistent with the conversation that was occurring on a national level. So we had in 2015, Jamar Clark was shot and killed by a white police officer, and that was very controversial and included protests on subsequent to that shooting. In 2016, there was another police shooting in a suburb outside St. Paul, Minnesota. Received some national attention. Philando Castile was shot and killed inside his vehicle by a police officer. And then while we were in the process of producing this report, there was a police shooting, a black Somali police officer shot Justine Damon, a white woman. So needless to say, there was tension and pain and a lot of discussion ongoing about the topic of police-community relations as we were preparing our report. One of the other challenges in selecting this topic with all of this in the dynamic was really looking for speakers and testifiers and subject matter experts that could provide a balance in light of the pain and trauma going on in the community. And so we spent a great deal of time just trying to identify testifiers that could represent the perspective, especially around the base of our report, which was President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. And looking at those 6 pillars, it was extremely important to us to find individuals from community, from academia, from law enforcement, and from the policymakers who provide that perspective over a myriad of those issues. Probably some of the testimony that was relevant to the formulation of our findings and recommendations came from individuals both from community, from academia, and from our policymakers, and that testimony from Dr. Ebony Ruland regarding the experiences that people of color have had with police here in the metro area, and she explained that distrust around the community's reaction to police response when calls for service went out from individuals from communities of color. It was ironic that one of the policymakers, then Minneapolis City Council President Barbara Johnson, talked about police mistrust, using an example of a woman who did not wish to call police for service because of an interaction this woman, one of her constituents, had with police when she was a young person. So although we had different individuals from different perspectives talking about the trust between police and community, they both identified the distrust and mistrust of police as one of the key issues. And that really sort of bubbled to the surface as one of our key themes, and that is that trust is fragile between police and community in the state of Minnesota, and certainly in the metro area where these incidents had occurred. and that trust needs to continue to be built. One of the other things that rose to the surface was that, police departments in Minnesota are being provided more tools and technology. And the debate is on whether or not that those tools and technology are a help or a hindrance to police community relations. And some of those tools and technology that people pointed out were body-worn cameras, tasers, use of chemical irritants, and one of our recommendations speaks directly to that. One of the other things that bubbled to the surface as we were hearing from testifiers from community and police, which was, is really ironic, because even though people believe they're really far away sometimes on this topic, they are really much closer together than they would realize, because both police and community talked about the recognition that trauma plays both in the community, but also with regards to trauma in the police department, and identified a need for that to be acknowledged, but also for things to be put in place that would address those things. One of the police chiefs from the two largest cities in Minnesota, former Chief Janae Harto, who was then police chief of Minneapolis, and police chief from St. Paul, Todd Axtell, talked about the 21st Century Policing recommendations as two of the police departments that were actually committed to improving their police departments using those pillars, and identified training and diversification of their police forces as key components that they were using to improve police community relations in their respective jurisdictions. And one of the other things that bubbled to the surface was how police departments, and using their tools and resources, also need to be using the data to drive their decision making. There are a lot of numbers and trends and data being collected by police departments, and the testifiers, especially those from the community, suggested that the police department actually used what they were collecting to make sure that that things were being done well for people in the community. We have several recommendations that we've identified in the report that I'm sure that you all have seen. The committee has not prioritized those recommendations. We have a meeting that's coming up where we plan on talking about what to do with this report, because we think there's good information in this report that needs to be shared on a wider basis. So I'd like to thank the commission, for sending letters to the individuals and organizations that we had identified the report and the recommendation needed to be forwarded to. And so we're going to talk about how to circle back on that and follow up with those individuals and organizations, and also talk about some of the other data points in this study that we need to drill down on. And so I will stop there to allow time for questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Corbell. I really appreciate it. I'm going to open for questions and comments from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Arasaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really want to appreciate the State Advisory Committee in Minnesota. I had the honor of actually attending that hearing, and there was incredible testimony, both by the police who came out, to their credit, in full force to talk about what they were trying to do to improve the situation, as well as by the community. And I was particularly struck by one of the stories that you do document in the report about an African-American woman who actually did a lot of work with the police, doing some training with them actually on many issues. And she herself had been stopped 4 times, once for having snow on her window and once for having a air freshener tag hanging from her mirror. And she was trying to make the point that if she, who works with the police, counts many of them as her friends, gets stopped in that way, and she feels that it erodes her trust. Can you imagine how someone who, in fact, doesn't have police as friends would feel? So it was a very powerful day, and I want to appreciate your work. I was very interested in a lot of the discussion around who makes up the police force and how does that impact policing, and the fact that in the city the residency requirement got struck out, and so that in fact the vast majority of police do not live in the communities that they police, and also that in your report, I think it said that only one African American had been graduated in one of the police academy forces. So I'm particularly interested in your recommendations around addressing that particular issue.
Madam Chair, thank you, Commissioner, for the compliment, and thank you for coming out and joining us at that hearing. There are 800 or so police officers in the Minneapolis Police Department. It probably is one of the most diverse police departments in the state. It ought to be, since Minneapolis is the most diverse city in the state. It's the largest city and most diverse city in the state. I don't recall which police department said that only one person of color had graduated from its police academy, but I do know that that is, recalling from the testimony of Chief Axtell and also from Chief Harto, that is a focus of theirs. And I know now with the new police chief, Madera Arredondo here in Minneapolis, who happens to be an African-American man, that is a focus for his work going forward as well. In terms of the makeup of the police departments in the state of Minnesota, 60% of the population of Minnesota resides here in the metro area. So, of course, the police departments are larger in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Bloomington also is one of those cities that make up the metro area. So the metro has the most diverse police department in the state. But also, ironically, there are over 400 police agencies in the state of Minnesota. About half of them have fewer than 25 officers in their police force, and that includes tribal police forces, non-municipal police forces, those at park board, colleges, transit police, etc. And so the farther you get out from the Twin Cities area, the less diverse the population becomes, the less diverse, of course, the police departments become. There are probably 5.5 million people in the state of Minnesota. The 85% of the people in the state are white. The largest minority group here are African American, Black and African American. That's only about 5% of the population, and then smaller percentages of racial and ethnic minorities as you look at the groups. So to have the recruitment effort and the focus to diversify these police forces is laudable. Not enough is happening quickly enough, but it is. So that's some of the realities that they're dealing with.
The second narrative that I was really struck with when I was there was the story that was told by Emily Baxter of contrasting an 18-year-old young African-American man who stole a single bottle of beer and was charged with petty theft, and then was later denied entrance to a career as a police officer. And the second, who was a 17-year-old who actually broke into a local liquor distribution plant building and threw a party, and he was now currently chief of police. And she told that story to make the point to counter what she believes is the false narrative of that the reason that minorities are overly present is because they're bad. They're more bad than whites. And in fact, she had been studying for 5 years, comparing youths who had committed similar non-violent criminal activity and documenting how white youth were more often given a warning and another opportunity to correct their behavior, while youth of color were not. And that the difference was not in who was committing some of these low-level petty crimes, but what kind of second chances people were giving and how they're being treated in the system. So I was very interested in that research, and if something like that is available, I would hope that that could be shared with the commission.
We certainly can pull that testimony from Ms. Baxter, and if we do have that report, we'll make sure that we get that. But, you know, along those same lines, that's one of the issues that we will be looking at here in Minneapolis in particular. Now, this in my regular job, I'm also the Civil Rights Director for the City of Minneapolis, because one of the points raised in this study was the disproportionate number of low-level offenses that people of color are charged with relative to their representation in the population. And so there's a disparate impact there. So there's work to be done. The data has given us some things to work with, and so we do plan on looking at that as we move forward.
Ms. Corbell, the 9th and the 10th recommendations in your report are to continue the 21st Century Task Force that had begun in the prior administration, and also to create an effective civilian oversight body for the state of Minnesota. And I wondered if you could expand on your views or the committee's views on the value of both recommendations.
Yes, thank you for that question. One of the challenges that we found with this report is that in trying to do a report that covered the entire state of Minnesota, we find that we were somewhat limited by the fact that the majority of the population and the police force is here in the metro area, as I mentioned. We actually attempted to do a survey of police forces in rural Minnesota. And the limitation was kind of twofold. First was the Paperwork Reduction Act, so we only were able to send surveys out to nine police agencies. But then even given that, the response was so low that the information collected was actually pretty unsubstantial. And so one of the reasons that we proposed this recommendation is that if we had a police oversight mechanism in the state of Minnesota, then someone who had that responsibility could look across all of these 400 or so agencies and hold them accountable to a certain set of standards. And so that's the rationale behind that recommendation. So the second part of your question on continuing an entity similar to the President's Task Force on 21st century policing, both, you know, here in the state of Minnesota, but sure wouldn't hurt on a national level either, is because the memories, people have short memories, because if you read in our study where we talk about implicit bias training, where when people go back and do surveys on how well people are attending to the filters that they're using with which to judge people of color, women, immigrants, etc., the closer they are to the implicit bias training, the more likely they are to say that implicit bias training worked. The farther you get away from that, the improvements are minimal. I think negligible is the word that the doctor used in the testimony that he provided. So similarly, if there's no one providing this oversight mechanism on a broader scale, both here in Minnesota and also on a national level, people will forget until the next tragedy. And so that's the reason for that recommendation.
Thanks very much. Are there other questions or comments from fellow commissioners? Okay. Ms. Corbell, thank you to you, and also again, thank you to Ms. Corey. These are both thorough, comprehensive reports. Really appreciate the work that your committees have done, and very much appreciate your presentation. You're taking the time for the presentation today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
We'll now consider our amended business items, beginning first with the proposed letter on the separation of children from their families after crossing the southern border. I'm going to read the letter as it's drafted so that we know what it is that we might vote on, and then I'll move to open the floor for discussion. So the text of the letter is to the Attorney General and to the Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and as is our convention, I won't read the footnotes just in the interest of time. So, dear Attorney General Sessions and Secretary Nielsen, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights writes to urge the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security to stop separating children from their families after crossing our southern border. In 2015, the Commission reported on immigrant detainee facilities, including the policies that separated children from families and placed those children in separate detention centers. We were concerned then that the government provided inadequate or inappropriate care when it took charge of undocumented children. Given recent reports, the Commission once again has grave concerns about the fair administration of justice due to coercive tactics and lack of due process afforded to these families. Reportedly, families seeking refuge are separated and children are shuffled into detention centers in what one judge stated was, quote, if true, brutal, offensive, and fails to comport with traditional notions of fair play and decency, end quote. The policies can coerce parents into withdrawing what may be valid asylum applications or otherwise impairing their immigration proceedings for fear of what may be happening to their children. The Commission's concerns are exacerbated by the apparent animus directed at Mexican and Central American immigrants by the administration, giving rise to questions of unwarranted discrimination on the basis of national origin. In the last 2 months, the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security have issued new directives instituting a zero-tolerance policy that has led to the increased separation of families. On May 4, 2018, the Department of Homeland Security issued an internal memorandum directing agents to prosecute all individuals crossing the border, even if that required separating children from their families. On May 7, 2018, Attorney General Sessions announced that the Department of Justice would pursue the policy. These recent policy directives changed long-standing border enforcement practices. The new policy unnecessarily separates families with no clear evidence that it increases border security. The Commission notes that a prior joint initiative of the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security that instituted a similar zero-tolerance approach did not reduce illegal border crossings, as verified by the Department of Homeland Security. The policy ignores the reality that many of those coming to the border are desperately seeking asylum fully within the parameters of our nation's immigration laws. The policy is inhumane and against the best interests of the children. By separating children from their families, the policy causes irreparable harm to children and families. International authorities are taking note and disapproving of the U.S. government's actions. There is also bipartisan agreement that keeping families together is the best policy. The Commission calls on the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security to stop this approach, which subverts the fair administration of justice and appears to discriminate against families on the basis of their national origin. Thank you for your consideration, and we look forward to your response sincerely, and it would be signed by members of the Commission. So I move that we open the floor for discussion of a vote to approve this letter to the Attorney General and to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on this statement? Commissioner Arasaki?
I support this statement. I am horrified by the fact that we are taking children as young as babies, infant children, away from their parents and basically holding them hostage in order to coerce their parents into giving up whatever claims of asylum they have. That is not the behavior of a civilized nation that professes to be committed to the rule of law and to human rights, and I strongly support this statement.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I strongly support this statement. As I understand it, many of these individuals are following the law, that they're showing up at the border seeking asylum as set out in our laws. And to be processed, handled in this way, I just don't understand it. I'm a mother myself, and I can't imagine complying with the law and my child or children being removed from me. And if even a fraction of these reports that we're getting are true. It rips my heart open, and I believe that there are many in this nation that share that, and we must speak up and out. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner
There
Harriet?
are many points made in this letter that I have sympathy for, but there are too many points that I can't sign on to, so I'm going to have to say no on this one.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Adegbile?
Yes, Madam Chair. Of course, the rule of law is important. It's important to everybody on this commission. I think it's also important that we understand that a great nation must also think about temperance and think about policy judgments about how the law is enforced, such that our policy choices about how laws are enforced don't have the effect of undermining the appreciation of the rule of law and visiting harsh outcomes on people that are not in a position to defend themselves. And I think the rule of law in America and its embrace traditionally of human rights is important. This is not our finest hour, and I hope the policy is revisited.
Thank you. Any further discussion?
Yes, Commissioner Yaki.
Commissioner Yaki?
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Kursanow.
Commissioner Kursanow.
Thank you, Commissioner Yaki. I support changing the law, but as the law stands currently, the reason parents and children are separated is because of, among other things, the Flores Consent Decree of 1997, the Ninth Circuit's interpretation thereof, which virtually mandates that there is going to be separation given that children can only be detained for 20 days. I support changing that, but one of the ironic things about this, we've been talking about the rule of law. One of the reasons that many immigrants come to this country is because we have the rule of law as opposed to the countries from which they have fled. And it's not simply a matter of maintaining the rule of law for the rule of law's sake. There are many things that flow from not maintaining the rule of law. A nation devolves into the kind of nations from which they are fleeing. And to which they are seeking asylum is the nation that preserves the rule of law and all that flows therefrom. So my preference is let's change the law, but I will be voting against this particular resolution, despite, as Commissioner Harriet said, I share many of the sympathies reflected in this letter.
Thank you, Commissioner Kursanow. I will say my colleagues at the National Center for Youth Law, where I litigate, are counsel in the Flores Consent Decree, and it will not be a surprise to you that it's not my case, and I don't have intimate knowledge of the inside of that case, but it is strongly not their view that the Flores Consent Decree mandates this action. So at best, reasonable minds could differ about at least that component. Commissioner Yaki?
Yes, I just wanted to echo your statement as well as Commissioner Yarasaki's and others. And to make the point about the dangers of sort of whether or not this requires a law change or not, which I do not believe it does. There are those who would seek to package a law change that would, they say, deal with this issue in the context of other laws enact at the same time, which would devastate immigration as we know it in this country and effectively close our borders to all but those who are rich enough to make it through. So I would just like to note that this letter makes a statement that these actions are not needed, that the law as it stands now can't allow these families to be together. There's no need for a fix, and there's certainly no need for a fix that seeks to play upon the well-founded concerns, fears, and of people by then using it to piggyback in a draconian change in our immigration law.
Thank you. Unless there's further discussion on the statement, I'll call for a roll call vote. Commissioner Adegbile, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Harriet?
No.
Commissioner Kursanow?
No.
Commissioner Gladney,
Yes.
Vice Chair Timmons Goodson,
Yes.
Commissioner Narasaki,
Yes.
Commissioner Yaki,
Aye.
and I vote yes. The motion passes. 2 commissioners opposed, no commissioner abstained, and all others were in favor. Our next item is the statement about the pardon of Jack Johnson. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Kirsten to read the statement so we're clear about what we're voting on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The statement is very brief. It says, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights applauds President Donald Trump's posthumous pardon of boxing great Jack Johnson. Mr. Johnson, an African-American, was the 1908 heavyweight champion of the world. He was subjected to racially motivated prosecutions for his relationships with white women, including a woman who later became his wife. Mr. Johnson fled the country to avoid imprisonment. He later returned to the United States to serve his sentence, but the conviction irrevocably damaged his career, and he was unable to regain the heavyweight title. Mr. Johnson applied for pardon in 1920, but the Harding administration refused to grant the application because of public opposition. Thanks to the efforts of many individuals, including Sylvester Stallone, President Trump pardoned Mr. Johnson on May 24th, 2018, only the 3rd time a president has granted a posthumous pardon. The Commission expresses its gratitude to President Trump for righting this historic injustice.
Thank you. We can discuss the statement. Is there a motion so we can open the floor for discussion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Terrific. Is there any discussion on the statement? Madam Vice Chair?
Yes. I have some concerns. And in terms of expressing those concerns, I don't want us to get in as a commission to place ourselves in a position where we applaud those pardons that we agree with, and then other pardons that we take issue with, speaking out against them. I'm concerned about the process, the policy involved. And so I have some reservations about voting in favor of issuing it.
Thank you. Commissioner Deglow?
Relatedly, I think that with some time, we might be able to get to a version of this statement that takes account of some broader considerations, but I think that we might want to consider taking some more time to do that. These pardons are happening in a larger context, and I think that the procedural considerations are important. And perhaps if we take some time, as Commissioner Harriet has suggested that we attempt to, in some other contexts, we might be able to find our way to consensus. The underlying sentiment expressed in Commissioner Kurzenow's resolution is important. There obviously was a unspeakable injustice visited on Mr. Johnson, and I think that with time we can probably get there.
I will say I share those sentiments. I am the child of an interracial marriage, which is the product of the type of crime for which Mr. Johnson was, I think, unjustly convicted. And I do think it is important to right past injustice, even 105 years later. And I appreciate the sentiment that underlies the proposed statement, and also the circulation of it, the proposed statement 2 days ago. But I do think that there's more work to be done, consistent with the Vice Chair's views about taking a position about the way that the pardon authority is used. And we have already, as a commission, expressed very serious concern about the use of the pardon authority in the case of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and we are seeing increasing instantiation of the pardon authority, including as recently as with respect to Jack Johnson, or functionally as recently with respect to Anne Marie Johnson. So I too would like some time to be able to try to work together on more fulsome text that can express the types of views being discussed. Commissioner Narasaki.
I would like to thank Commissioner Kursanow for bringing this up. I was not familiar with the history of Mr. Johnson, and I do believe that the pardon was merited, and I would like to have the commission make a statement, but I agree with others that would like to see it more fully fleshed out, and I think that we could probably get to a place, hopefully, where we could have a unanimous statement.
Madam Chair?
Commissioner Kursanow.
Thank you. The thanks that Commissioner Narasaki directs to me should appropriately be directed toward Commissioner Chladny and the rest of the commission, because we voted unanimously to seek such a pardon for Jack Johnson, and Commissioner Chladny introduced that motion. I am happy to table this until next month's meeting in order to see if we can reach a consensus on this. If the majority wishes, I will defer until next month.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for the discussion on this item. Our next item is Commissioner Harriet's suggestion that we discuss a motion related to printing reports. Would you like to make the motion? We can discuss it.
Aren't we better off just with a discussion first? Can we do that? Because it's not clear to me what the motion should be.
Okay.
It's just I'm very concerned about the notion of not printing our reports at all. I think that's a mistake. I think there are many people who prefer a written report. And they are more likely to read, and they are more likely to keep a report that is printed than something that they read on the internet or something that they even print from the internet. One problem that we have is simply one of timing here. At this point in time, our website is ghastly, and trying to get a report to download, I have on many occasions simply given up and decided that, well, I guess I don't need to read that report after all. And if I'm willing to do that, and I care deeply about our reports, there are a lot of people who, when told, here, use this link, they're not going to even get their computers to download the report, much less entice them to want to wait for the report to download and to fully print. Many people don't like printing out long documents. I think that we have in the past wasted some money by printing too many reports. But as Commissioner Narasaki pointed out, it's also true that most of the money that has to be spent when you print a report is right up front, whether you're printing 1, 2, or 10,000. That's true. But nevertheless, I think that we need to rethink the notion that we don't need to print reports anymore. I mean, one of the examples I gave when we were meeting informally about the budget this morning was how different it is when you have a printed report with a cover, and when you're done looking at it, I think many people would put something like that on their bookshelf, where they might then forget about it. But 1 year, 2 years, 6 years later, there it still is, and they're reminded of it. If we go to an internet-only way of distributing our reports, that use of the report disappears, because once they're done looking at it, if they're lucky enough to have downloaded it from our website, then it goes down the memory hole. They don't recall it anymore, and they won't ever see it again. And I think something's lost there. I think that this is the core of what the commission does. It issues reports. And if there are no written reports, or if we have to print them up on an ordinary printer, staple them together, it looks very unprofessional. And we need to be taking into consideration the cost of that too. If we say we're saving money by not printing reports, well, we're going to be paying for that. In part, and it won't be as expensive, but it will nevertheless be a cost of printing up, large numbers of these reports, stapling together, and hustling down to House office buildings or to the Department of Justice or to the Department of Education with these unwieldy and very unprofessional looking reports. I think that's a loss. And again, that will also be expensive. 300 pages times how many ever get printed up that's money that has to be looked at as counterbalancing the printing costs. So what I would like to do, and in fact, in a sense, there's no need for a motion here because the commission can always do this. And that is, with each report, make an ad hoc decision about whether to print that report or whether to, if so, how many. The problem is if we plan as if there's going to be no printing cost, then we won't be able to make that decision. And I think that's a big mistake. I think we're going to want to print reports in the future.
Commissioner Nagasaki.
As a daughter of librarian, I actually like to have printed materials in my hands and appreciate the sentiment that Commissioner Harriet has made. I think the challenge is to me, it's all about trade-offs in the budget. And as we all know, our budget had been virtually flat for 20 years, which meant that in real dollars, we have been losing budget size, and we have managed to survive by cutting staff, by having to shut down regional offices, by having to make a lot of very tough choices. And here we face another one. As Commissioner Harriet notes, our website is barely functional, as are our computers and our software, which is like, I think, a decade old. I'm not even sure what language our computers speak, but I know that it doesn't speak to my computer, which is only 5 years old. So, and that's the challenge. And do we print off nice looking reports in an age where people are really doing their research more and more online? Or do we try to save some of that money and actually improve our website and give our staff the kind of computers and software we need to really be as efficient as possible, because we have a shrinking number of staff. And I think that's the challenge. That's the reality of having a fairly flat budget. Congress was wonderful in giving us some additional money so that we could expand some of our hearings and support better our state advisory committees, who we heard today are doing incredible work. But they did not allow us to be able to use any of that money to fix some of these operational issues that we really have. So to me, you can't just look at one part of the budget in isolation. You need to look at it in the context of our overall budget. And I think staff are really trying to make difficult choices. And I think that commissioners do not help if we try to just pick off different issues in isolation.
I will say I share, I think, all the sentiments described so far. I too, very much enjoy having a book to hold in hand and to refer back to, and I am sufficiently a Luddite that I tend to write in the margins, and I like to be able to find those again and to see my highlights. We are in a time where we are in extraordinary fiscal constraint, and in the year and a half that I've had the pleasure and honor to serve on this commission, I have watched our staff struggle under I think, enormous constraints to be able to do the work that they are charged to do. I'm very grateful for what they nonetheless accomplish. I think that the work that we have been putting out is extraordinary, and I'm very grateful for what that looks like and what I think will continue in these difficult budgetary times. I think we need to be able to support the staff we have and to privilege our output over the production of written, pretty accessible documents. I will also say that I think we all would like to see our website updated. I think that's something that would be something that is a goal for all of us. And in my experience, I have been able to download all of our reports and have been able to download our past reports as well. And so I appreciate being able to have ready access to
Well, I'd like to be able to do that too.
I'm happy to share with you
Am I not right
So-
that Congress, in giving us the extra money, wanted it used on reports, including SAC reports, but also our reports? So this actually goes with what Congress intended that extra money to go for.
I don't agree with that assessment. I think that Congress absolutely wanted us to have more output. I read no text in our appropriations language or the staff report that suggested that Congress wanted us to print them. And in fact, my conversations at the Hill have included Hill staff direct admonishment that we discontinue practices that use our costs that way. So I think that we need to be very, very cautious about our funds, our fund usage, and also we can all hope for a time when we have fewer fiscal constraints and more opportunities for how we can spend those dollars.
Madam Chair, I am truly torn, and a lot of what Commissioner Harriet says makes sense. I wonder whether, in fact, this is an issue that we need to vote on or make a definitive decision at this time. I ask that we consider using our considerable creativity and see if we can't find a way to split the baby. As Commissioner Harriet says, not all of our reports perhaps need to be printed, and certainly not in the manner in which we've done it in the past, but there are some. If only the statutory reports, for example. But anyway, I ask that we use our considerable creativity to see if we can't come up with a way to split the baby and have some that are actually printed. But need we make that decision now?
Commissioner Harriet.
I have to leave in 10 minutes, but it makes sense to me that this doesn't have to be decided right now. It can be left up in the air for a while. It's not like we're printing a report today. And so, if we want, we can continue this discussion in July. And if time doesn't permit then we can continue it in August. It's not possible for the commission to bind itself never to print a report. But we like to be a little bit more organized than that and have a policy. So, I would propose we continue the discussion at a later meeting, July, and if that's not possible, August.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the discussion today. Thank you for raising it. And with that, we'll turn to the staff director report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have nothing more to discuss beyond what's already contained in the director's report. As always, I stand available if any commissioner has a particular question that is in the report. But I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the coming on board of our law clerks and interns, and I see a lot of their faces out there in the audience at the moment. So I want to take a moment just to read off their names, and as the commissioners cycle through the agency this summer to introduce themselves and avail themselves of getting to know some incredibly bright minds and a lot of really great hard work that they're already doing for us. And so I want to say thank you to all of the law clerks and interns. And let me go ahead and read your names. And I apologize if I make a mistake. One of the worst characteristics that I have is sometimes I can fumble the name, but in any case, I want to welcome Scott Paulins. Scott, welcome to here. I want to welcome Valentina Kavanagh. I want to welcome Amy Jenneret. I want to welcome Jake Goldberg. I want to welcome Shimang Zhang. I want to welcome Aaron Hurd. I want to welcome Zach Lutz. Welcome to Madeline Cook. Welcome to Nicole Carroll. Welcome Matt Robinson, who I'm just going to do a shout out because you're at USC and I'm a USC alum. I want to do a shout or say welcome to Sabrina Escalara Flexhong. And I want to welcome Amy Jo, who is here as well. So thank you all for the hard work. I look forward to seeing you throughout the summer. Please, my office is open anytime you want to chat and have a cup of coffee and kind of talk about the work we're doing and why your involvement is so important. My door is always open. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. That's all I have. And so with that, Over to you.
Terrific. Well, I will echo the thanks and the gratitude to our interns this summer. You're exponentially increasing our efficacy. We're really thrilled to be able to have you. And I know it's my hope. I think I speak for all of our commissioners in saying that it is our hope that this experience with us this summer will redouble your commitment to civil rights and to public service. And we really very much look forward to continue to work with you and are very grateful that you're here. So thank you very much for that. And also very many thanks to our staff for making sure that today's meeting has run as smoothly as it has, which has been my also consistent experience of this staff, for which I'm very, very grateful. So with that, I will hereby adjourn our meeting at 2:43 Eastern Time.